The courthouse doors burst open with such force that dust motes exploded into the afternoon sunlight. And Oakley Zimmerman knew in that moment her life was about to shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Judge Cornelius Warren emerged from his chambers with papers clutched in his weathered hands, his expression grave as he surveyed the packed courtroom in Fairplay, Colorado. It was September 1878, and the mining town nestled high in the Rockies had seen its share of disputes, but nothing quite like this. Oakley sat ramrod straight in the front pew, her black mourning dress still fresh despite the 3 months that had passed since they buried Robert. Her hands trembled in her lap, hidden beneath the folds of her skirt. Across the narrow aisle she could feel him watching her. Hayes Xavier, the man her late husband had despised with every fiber of his being. The judge cleared his throat, and the murmuring crowd fell silent. This court has examined the land records, the testimonies, and the disputed will of Robert Zimmerman. The matter before us concerns the Zimmerman homestead, all 160 acres, including the main house, barn, and water rights to Beaver Creek. Oakley's breath caught. Everything. Everything Robert had built, everything they had dreamed of together during their 5 years of marriage, hung in the balance. After careful consideration, Judge Warren continued, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls, this court finds that Robert Zimmerman's original claim was filed improperly. The eastern half of the disputed property rightfully belongs to Hayes Xavier, whose prior claim was never properly dissolved. Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. Oakley felt the blood drain from her face. However, the judge raised his voice over the commotion. Mrs. Zimmerman's homestead rights as a widow are also legally sound for the western portion. Therefore, I am ordering that the property be divided equally between Hayes Xavier and Oakley Zimmerman. You will share access to the water rights, the road, and you will maintain the existing structures jointly until such time as alternative arrangements can be made. Your Honor, that's impossible. Oakley found herself on her feet, propriety abandoned. That man accused my husband of theft, of fraud, of things that weren't true. He made Robert's last months miserable with these proceedings, and now you expect me to share my home with him. Hayes Xavier stood as well, his tall frame unfolding with deliberate slowness. At 28, he was 4 years Oakley's senior, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that fell just past his collar. His eyes, she had noted despite herself, were an unusual shade of amber, like honey held up to the light. I don't want this any more than you do, Mrs. Zimmerman. But my claim was filed first, and your husband knew it when he built on my land. Your land. Oakley's voice rose, fury overriding her grief. My husband worked himself to death building that homestead. He planted every tree, laid every stone in that foundation, and you were nowhere to be found. I was driving cattle to Dodge City, Hayes said, his jaw tight, making money to develop that very land. When I returned, Robert had moved in and refused to leave. Judge Warren slammed his gavel 3 times. Enough. My decision stands. You have 2 weeks to determine how you will divide the property and establish boundaries. I suggest you learn to cooperate because neither of you is going anywhere. Court dismissed. The judge swept out, leaving chaos in his wake. Oakley stood frozen as the courtroom emptied around her, her mind reeling. Share the homestead with Hayes Xavier. The man Robert had called a liar and a cheat. The man who had shown up 8 months ago demanding they vacate, producing claims and documents that threw their entire life into question. Mrs. Zimmerman. His voice came from directly behind her, low and careful. We need to talk about this. She turned slowly, drawing herself up to her full height, which still left her a good 6 inches shorter than him. Up close, She could see the road dust on his boots, the calluses on his hands. A working man's hands. We have nothing to discuss, Mr. Xavier. I'll take the western half with the house. You can have the eastern fields and the barn. The barn is where all the tools are kept, and the western half has most of the irrigated land. Then perhaps you should have been here to file your objections before my husband spent 5 years improving the property, Oakley said coldly. She gathered her reticule and moved toward the aisle, but Hayes stepped into her path. I know you hate me, he said quietly. And I know you think I'm responsible for what happened to Robert, but I never wanted any of this. I just wanted what was rightfully mine. Oakley met his eyes, those strange amber eyes that seemed to see right through her anger to the grief and fear beneath. My husband is dead, Mr. Xavier. He worked himself into an early grave trying to defend our home. Whether you intended it or not, you bear responsibility for that. Now please, move aside. He stepped back, and she swept past him with as much dignity as she could muster. But as she pushed through the courthouse doors into the bright September afternoon, she felt the weight of her situation settle over her like a lead blanket. She was a widow at 24, with no family, no money beyond what little savings they had managed, and now only half a homestead to her name. And she would be sharing that half with the enemy. The ride back to the homestead took nearly an hour, her aging mare picking her way carefully along the mountain road. Oakley had made this journey 1,000 times, but today, every familiar landmark felt different, tainted. The stand of aspen where Robert had proposed. The bend in Beaver Creek where they had picnicked on their first anniversary. The ridge where they had stood together, planning their future, talking about the children they would have, the life they would build, all of it, built on disputed land, built on a lie if Hayes Xavier was to be believed. But Robert wouldn't have done that. Her Robert had been honest and good and hardworking. He had found an unclaimed piece of land and filed the proper papers. He had checked with the land office in Denver. He had done everything right, hadn't he? Doubt crept in like cold water, and Oakley pushed it away angrily. Robert was dead. She wouldn't dishonor his memory with suspicions now. The homestead came into view as she crested the final hill, and despite everything, her heart lifted slightly. The log cabin Robert had built with his own hands, chinked with clay from the creek bed. The barn, smaller than most but sturdy and well made. The garden plot she had tended, now harvested and put to bed for winter. The rail fence Robert had started the summer before he died, still unfinished along the eastern boundary. The eastern boundary that now belonged to Hayes Xavier. Oakley dismounted and led her mare to the barn, unsaddling her with practiced efficiency. The familiar tasks soothed her jangled nerves somewhat. Feed and water the horse. Check on the 3 cattle in the near pasture. Collect eggs from the chickens. Normal things. Controllable things. She was hauling water from the creek when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Her stomach clenched as Hayes Xavier rode into view, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. He saw her and changed direction, approaching slowly. "Didn't expect you to come out here today," Oakley said, setting down her buckets. Hayes dismounted, removing his hat. His hair was damp with sweat. "Figured we should start working out the details. Judge gave us 2 weeks. There's nothing to work out. I told you in town, I keep the western half with the house. You take the eastern half with the barn." "The barn is on the western half, Mrs. Zimmerman. So is the well." Oakley blinked. She hadn't thought of that. The barn sat about 20 yards from the house, and the well was between them. If they split the property down the middle, both structures would be on her side. "Then we'll have to draw the line differently," she said stiffly. Hayes pulled a folded paper from his pocket, spreading it on a nearby fence post. It was a rough map of the property. I spent the last few days surveying. If we draw the boundary line here, he traced a diagonal line with his finger, we each get equal acreage. You keep the house and the garden plot. I get the barn and access to the well. Oakley studied the map, her mind working through the implications. The line he proposed would cut right through the middle of the property, but at an angle that gave her the best pasture land and most of the irrigation from Beaver Creek. It was, she had to admit, surprisingly fair. "And what about the water rights?" she asked. "We share them." "Equal access to the creek and the well." "And the road?" "Shared access." Oakley looked up at him, suspicious. "Why are you being so reasonable about this?" Hayes's expression was unreadable. "Because I'm not the villain you think I am, Mrs. Zimmerman. I don't want to make your life harder than it already is. I just want to work my land in peace." "This was my land first," Oakley said, but the words lacked heat. "According to the claim I filed in 1875, it was mine," Hayes replied quietly. "But I'm not interested in arguing about the past. We have to live with the judge's decision. We might as well make it bearable." Oakley looked back at the map, then at the homestead, trying to imagine it divided. Trying to imagine this man living just yards away, a constant reminder of everything she had lost. "We'll need a fence," she said finally. "A proper boundary marker." "Agreed. I can't afford to hire help for it." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Neither can I, truth be told. The cattle drive didn't pay what I hoped. I spent most of it on supplies and the court costs." They stood in awkward silence, the implication hanging between them. If they wanted a fence, they would have to build it themselves, together. "I suppose we start tomorrow then," Oakley said finally, her voice flat. "Dawn, I'll provide lunch." "I'll bring the tools and materials," Hayes said. He folded up the map and handed it to her. "For your records." She took it without meeting his eyes. "Mr. Xavier, I want you to know that I will never forgive you for what this did to Robert. This dispute, this stress, it killed him as surely as if you had put a bullet in him. So don't expect friendship or pleasantries. I'll work with you because I have no choice, but that's all you'll get from me." Hayes's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. "Understood, Mrs. Zimmerman." He mounted his horse and rode toward the eastern fields without looking back. Oakley watched him go, then carried her water buckets to the house. Inside, the cabin felt empty and cold despite the warmth of the September evening. She lit the stove and began preparing a simple supper, but her appetite had vanished. She kept seeing the map, that diagonal line cutting through the life she and Robert had built. That night, she lay in the bed she had shared with her husband and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Through the window, she could see a small campfire in the distance, on what was now Hayes Xavier's half of the property. He had made camp there, establishing his presence, claiming his territory. She rolled over and buried her face in her pillow, finally letting the tears come. Tears for Robert, for her shattered life, for the future that had died with him. Tears of frustration and anger and bone-deep exhaustion. When she finally slept, her dreams were troubled, full of fences and boundaries and amber eyes that watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Dawn came cold and clear, frost glittering on the grass. Oakley rose and dressed in her oldest work dress, pulling on Robert's boots over thick wool socks. She braided her dark blonde hair tightly and covered it with a scarf, then went out to start her morning chores. The cattle needed feeding, the chickens tending, the garden checked for any vegetables she might have missed in yesterday's harvest. She was hauling another load of water when Hayes appeared, riding in from his camp. He had a pack horse loaded with fence posts, wire, and tools. In the morning light, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the lines around his eyes. He hadn't slept well either. "Morning," he said, dismounting. "Mr. Xavier," she acknowledged, not quite able to bring herself to wish him good morning. They worked in silence at first, using stakes and string to mark out the boundary line according to his map. Hayes paced off the distances with long strides while Oakley hammered in the stakes. It was physical work, and she found herself grateful for it. Action was better than thinking. By mid-morning, they had the line marked and had begun digging the post holes. The earth was hard and rocky this close to the mountains, and each hole was a battle. Hayes worked with efficient strength, his shovel biting deep into the soil. Oakley worked beside him, struggling more with the rocky ground but refusing to show weakness. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. "You should let me handle the digging," Hayes said after watching her wrestle with a particularly stubborn rock. "No shame in it. I outweigh you by a good 70 pounds. "I can manage," Oakley said through gritted teeth, finally levering the rock free. "I'm sure you can, but we'll finish faster if we work to our strengths. You're better at keeping the line straight and measuring the spacing than I am." It was a practical suggestion, but Oakley bristled anyway. "I'm not some delicate flower who can't handle hard work, Mr. Xavier." "I never said you were," Hayes replied evenly. He drove his shovel into the ground and leaned on it, looking at her directly. "Mrs. Zimmerman, I know you hate me. You've made that clear. But if we're going to work together for the next several days, could we at least try to be civil? I'm not trying to insult you. I'm trying to get this fence built efficiently." Oakley wanted to argue, but she couldn't find fault with his logic. She was better at the measuring and planning. He was stronger for the digging. "Fine," she said shortly. "You dig. I'll measure and mark." They fell into a rhythm after that. Oakley would measure the distance for the next post, mark the spot, and Hayes would dig the hole. Then together they would set the post, tamping the earth tight around it. It was exhausting work, but satisfying in its way. The line of posts grew steadily across the property, a visible marker of the division between them. At noon, Oakley went to the house and prepared lunch as promised. Cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and apples from her trees. She carried it out on a tray and set it on a stump without ceremony. They ate in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the fence line they were creating. "Good bread," Hayes said after a while. Oakley didn't respond. "I mean it." "Best I've had in months." "Thank you," she said stiffly, because ignoring a compliment entirely would be childish. Hayes took a long drink from his canteen, then wiped his mouth. "Can I ask you something?" "I'd rather you didn't." "Fair enough." He fell silent again, finishing his meal. But curiosity got the better of Oakley. "What did you want to ask?" Hayes looked surprised that she had engaged, then thoughtful. "I wanted to know what Robert told you about the property claim, about how he came to settle here." Anger flared in Oakley's chest. "How dare you? You think my husband lied to me?" "I think there are two sides to every story," Hayes said carefully. "I'm not trying to accuse anyone of anything. I just want to understand what happened." "What happened," Oakley said coldly, "is that my husband found an unclaimed piece of land, filed the proper paperwork with the land office, and built a home for us. That's what happened. And he never mentioned anyone else having a prior claim. Why would he if there wasn't one?" Oakley stood abruptly, gathering the lunch things. "This conversation is over." She stalked back to the house, her heart pounding. How dare he question Robert's integrity? How dare he try to plant seeds of doubt in her mind? Robert had been honest. Robert had been good. Robert wouldn't have knowingly built on someone else's land. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered, what if he did? What if he made a mistake? What if the land office gave him wrong information? No, she wouldn't entertain these thoughts. Robert deserved better. When she returned to the fence line, Hayes was back to work, digging the next post hole. He didn't mention their conversation, and neither did she. They worked through the afternoon until the sun began to sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "That's enough for today," Hayes said, straightening and stretching his back. "We made good progress, got about a third of the posts in." Oakley surveyed their work. The line of posts marched across the property in a neat diagonal, exactly where he had marked it on the map. It was good work, solid work. She hated to admit it, but they had made an effective team. "Same time tomorrow?" Hayes asked. Oakley nodded curtly. "Dawn." He gathered his tools and mounted his horse. As he rode away, Oakley stood alone on her side of the emerging fence and felt the loneliness of her situation crash over her like a wave. This was her life now. Divided, diminished, shared with a stranger who represented everything she had lost. The next 3 days fell into a similar pattern. They worked from dawn until dusk, stopping only for the brief lunch Oakley provided. The conversation remained minimal, professional. Hayes would occasionally try to engage her in talk about the weather or the quality of the soil, and Oakley would respond with the absolute minimum required by politeness. She was keeping her promise. She was civil, but nothing more. The physical work was both exhausting and therapeutic. Oakley fell into bed each night too tired to think, too spent to dream. Her hands developed new blisters that hardened into calluses. Her shoulders ached from tamping posts and stretching wire. But the fence grew steadily, a tangible result of their labor. On the 4th day, they reached the creek. This was the trickiest part of the boundary, as they both needed access to the water. Hayes had designed the fence to angle down to the creek bank, cross at a shallow point, and continue up the other side. They would leave a gate on each side for the cattle and horses to reach the water. "We'll need to dig deeper here," Hayes said, examining the rocky creek bed. "The spring runoff can get pretty fierce. Don't want the posts washing out." Oakley nodded, studying the water. It ran clear and cold over smooth stones, the same creek where she had washed clothes, where she and Robert had cooled their feet on hot summer days. Now it would be divided like everything else. They worked in the creek bed, their boots soaked, the cold water numbing their feet. It was miserable work, but Hayes never complained, just kept digging and hauling rocks to brace the posts. Oakley found herself grudgingly respecting his work ethic, even as she resented his presence. "Hand me that sledge," Hayes said, positioning a post. Oakley passed him the sledgehammer, and he drove the post deep into the creek bed with powerful, rhythmic strikes. Sweat darkened his shirt despite the cold water, and Oakley found herself noticing the strength in his arms, the competent way he handled the tools. She looked away quickly, angry at herself for noticing anything about him beyond his function as a fence-building partner. "Mrs. Zimmerman, can you brace this side?" Hayes asked, positioning another post. Oakley moved to hold it steady while he filled in around the base with rocks and gravel. They were standing close together in the narrow creek bed, close enough that she could smell the honest sweat on him, mixed with leather and something else, something that reminded her of cedar. "That should hold," Hayes said, testing the post. His hand brushed against hers on the wood, and Oakley jerked back as if burned. "Sorry," Hayes said, stepping away. "It's fine," Oakley replied quickly, too quickly. She scrambled up the creek bank, putting distance between them. "I'll start on the next hole." They finished the creek crossing by late afternoon. As they stood back to survey their work, Oakley had to admit it looked solid. The posts stood firm against the current, and the design would allow both of them access while still maintaining a clear boundary. "Tomorrow we start stringing the wire," Hayes said. "That'll go faster than the posts." "Good," Oakley said. She was ready to be done with this project, done with spending every day in his presence, done with the confusion of emotions that kept ambushing her when she least expected it. anger at him for disrupting her life, respect for his competence and fairness, and something else she refused to name, something that stirred when he smiled at the horses or when he carefully moved a toad out of the way before tamping a post. That night, Oakley sat on her porch as the stars emerged overhead. Across the fence line, she could see Hayes's campfire. He was cooking something, the smoke drifting up into the darkening sky. She wondered why he didn't move into the barn now that the boundary was established. It had a loft that could be made into living quarters. It would certainly be more comfortable than camping. Maybe he was giving her space, letting her adjust to the new reality before taking up permanent residence. If so, it was a thoughtful gesture, and she didn't want to acknowledge it because that would mean acknowledging that he was more than the villain she needed him to be. The next morning brought rain, a cold drizzle that soaked through clothes and turned the ground to mud. Oakley debated whether to wait it out, but Hayes appeared at dawn as usual, wearing an oilskin coat. "Still want to work?" he called across the fence line. Oakley squared her shoulders. "I'm not made of sugar. I won't melt." She pulled on Robert's old rain slicker and joined Hayes at the fence. Stringing wire in the rain was cold, miserable work. The metal was slippery, hard to grip. The posts were slick. They both kept losing their footing in the mud, but they persisted, working their way down the line of posts, attaching the wire at precise heights, stretching it tight. By midday, they were both soaked through despite their rain gear. Oakley's teeth were chattering, and she could see that Hayes was shivering too. "We should stop," he said. "This is dangerous. Someone's going to get hurt." "Just a little more," Oakley insisted, not wanting to admit defeat. "Mrs. Zimmerman, you're turning blue. This isn't worth getting sick over." "I'm fine," Oakley said, but her numb fingers slipped on the wire at that moment, and she felt the sharp metal bite into her palm. She cried out before she could stop herself. Hayes was at her side instantly. "Let me see." "It's nothing," Oakley said, but blood was already seeping through her clenched fingers. "It's not nothing. Come on." Hayes took her elbow and steered her toward the house. Oakley wanted to protest, but the pain in her hand was sharp and insistent, and she was so cold she could barely think straight. Inside the cabin, Hayes guided her to a chair by the stove and went immediately to feed more wood into it. The fire blazed up, spreading welcome warmth. Then he went to the wash basin and pumped fresh water. "I can do this myself," Oakley said weakly. "Just let me help," Hayes replied, kneeling beside her chair. Gently, he uncurled her fingers. The cut was deep, running across her palm. "You'll need stitches." "I can do it." "Have you ever stitched yourself before?" Oakley hesitated. "No. I have trail injuries. Let me do this, Mrs. Zimmerman, please." There was something in his voice, a genuine concern that melted some of her resistance. She nodded slowly. Hayes was efficient and surprisingly gentle. He cleaned the wound thoroughly, then retrieved a needle and thread from his saddlebag. "This is going to hurt," he warned. "I know," Oakley said, bracing herself. The first stitch made her gasp, but Hayes's hand was steady, his touch careful. He worked quickly, his brow furrowed in concentration. Oakley found herself studying his face as he worked, seeing the man rather than the enemy for the first time. There was no cruelty in his features, no hardness, just focus and competence and something that looked like genuine worry. "All done," Hayes said finally, tying off the last stitch. "Keep it clean and dry. I'll finish the fence work for the next few days." "I can still help," Oakley protested. "Not with that hand, you can't. Don't be stubborn about this." "I'm not stubborn," Oakley said, hearing the ridiculousness of the statement even as it left her mouth. Hayes smiled slightly. It was the first time she had seen him really smile, and it transformed his face, making him look younger, less careworn. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Mrs. Zimmerman, but I respect that. You'd have to be stubborn to survive out here alone." "I manage," Oakley said softly. "I know you do." Hayes stood and moved to the door. "Get some rest. Keep that hand elevated. I'll check on you tomorrow." He was gone before Oakley could respond, leaving her sitting by the warm stove with her bandaged hand and a head full of confused thoughts. He had been kind, more than kind. He had been gentle and skilled and genuinely concerned for her welfare. These were not the actions of a villain. But if Hayes Xavier wasn't a villain, then what did that make Robert? What did that make her grief and anger? She didn't want to think about it. Couldn't think about it. So she closed her eyes and let the warmth of the stove lull her into an uneasy doze. True to his word, Hayes finished the fence over the next 3 days while Oakley rested her hand. She watched him from her porch, working alone, stringing wire and hanging the gates. He worked steadily from dawn to dusk, never complaining, never cutting corners. On the second day she brought him lunch at midday, feeling guilty about sitting idle while he worked. "You don't have to do this," Hayes said, accepting the food gratefully. "You're working on my behalf as much as your own," Oakley replied. "It's only fair." They sat on opposite sides of the now nearly complete fence and ate in companionable silence. The rain had passed, leaving the world washed clean and bright. The aspen on the hillside were starting to turn gold, their leaves shimmering in the breeze. "It's beautiful country," Hayes said, following her gaze. "It is," Oakley agreed. "That's why Robert and I chose it." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you my side now, without you getting angry?" Oakley's first instinct was to refuse, but she found her curiosity overriding her defensiveness. "All right." Hayes set down his food and leaned back against a fence post. "I first came through here in the spring of 1875. I was driving cattle north and we stopped to rest the herd. I saw this valley and knew it was perfect for ranching. Good water, good grass, sheltered from the worst of the winter winds. So I filed a claim with the land office in Denver. Paid my fees, did everything proper. Then I went back to Texas to collect my pay and gather supplies." He paused, his expression distant. "That took longer than I expected. There were complications with the sale of the cattle, and then I got hired for another drive. By the time I made it back here in the fall of 1876, over a year later, there was a cabin on my land and a man who said it was his." Oakley listened, her heart sinking. "I showed Robert my claim papers," Hayes continued. "He showed me his. We both went to the land office. That's when we discovered that the clerk who processed Robert's claim had made an error. He had transposed some numbers in the legal description. Robert thought he was filing for unclaimed land to the west, but the papers actually described my property. It was an honest mistake, but it meant both our claims were valid in different ways." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Oakley asked. "Would you have believed me?" She thought about that. No, probably not. She would have assumed he was lying to manipulate her. "Robert and I fought about it for months," Hayes said. "Not with fists, but with lawyers and paperwork and trips to Denver. We both spent money we didn't have trying to prove our case. And the whole time, we both got more and more entrenched in our positions. I thought he was a squatter trying to steal my land. He thought I was a fraud trying to cheat him." "Were you?" Oakley asked quietly. "A fraud?" Hayes met her eyes directly. "No, Mrs. Zimmerman. I swear to you, everything I told you is the truth. I have the original papers if you want to see them." Oakley looked at his face, searching for any sign of deception. She found none, and suddenly she was struck by a terrible thought. Did Robert know about the error in his claim? Hayes hesitated. "I think he suspected. But he had built the cabin by then. He had brought you out here. He couldn't just walk away from all that work, all that investment. So he convinced himself that my claim was invalid, that the dates didn't matter, that possession was 9/10 of the law. And maybe he was right. Maybe if he had lived longer, the courts would have sided with him entirely. But he didn't live longer, Oakley said, her voice barely a whisper. No, Hayes agreed gently. And I'm sorry for that, Mrs. Zimmerman, truly sorry. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. I just wanted what I had worked for, same as Robert did. Oakley felt tears pricking her eyes. He worried himself sick over this. The stress, the legal fees, the uncertainty. It wore him down. He caught pneumonia last winter and never fully recovered. And then in June, his heart just gave out. The doctor said it was like he had used up all his strength. I'm sorry, Hayes said again, and the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. They sat in silence for a long while, the weight of the past settling between them. Oakley felt something shifting inside her, a cracking of the armor she had built around her grief and anger. If what Hayes said was true, and she was increasingly certain that it was, then there was no villain in this story. Just two men with legitimate claims, caught in a bureaucratic error, too proud or too desperate to compromise. Thank you for telling me, Oakley said finally. I needed to hear it. Hayes nodded, then stood and stretched. I should get back to work. Fence won't finish itself. Hayes, Oakley said, using his given name for the first time. He turned, surprise evident on his face. Let me help. My hand is healing well enough, and it's our fence. We should finish it together. A slow smile spread across Hayes's face. I'd like that, Oakley. The use of her first name should have bothered her, but somehow it didn't. It felt natural, like a boundary had been crossed and they were on new ground now, ground where they could be something other than enemies. They worked together that afternoon, and the atmosphere between them had changed. The silence was no longer hostile but comfortable. When Hayes handed her tools, his fingers no longer jerked away if they touched hers. When Oakley made a suggestion about the fence alignment, Hayes listened and often agreed. By evening, the fence was complete. They stood back and surveyed their work together. It ran in a neat diagonal across the property, from the northern boundary all the way to the southern edge, with gates at the road and the creek. It was a good fence, strong and straight, and they had built it together. We did well, Hayes said. We did, Oakley agreed. She felt a strange mix of satisfaction and melancholy. The fence was finished. There was no reason for them to work together anymore. They would go back to being neighbors, separate and apart, living on their divided halves. I'll be moving into the barn, Hayes said, as if reading her thoughts. Start fixing up the loft. I'll need to get it habitable before the serious cold sets in. When will you start? Tomorrow, I suppose. Oakley nodded. Tomorrow, back to being alone. Back to the isolation she had been living with since Robert died. The thought was unbearable. Or, she found herself saying, you could come for dinner tonight, as a thank you, for finishing the fence and for tending my hand. Hayes looked surprised, then pleased. I'd like that very much. Come at sunset, Oakley said, suddenly nervous about what she had just offered. I'll cook something proper. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a flurry of preparation. She pulled out the good tablecloth, the one she had been saving for special occasions. She killed and roasted a chicken, made biscuits, prepared vegetables from her garden. She even baked a pie with the last of her preserved cherries. It was far more than a simple thank you dinner required, and she knew it, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. As she worked, she thought about the past 2 weeks, about the way her feelings toward Hayes had slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifted. She still missed Robert desperately. She still mourned the life they had been building. But Hayes wasn't responsible for Robert's death, any more than Robert had been a liar or a cheat. They had both been caught in circumstances beyond their control, and they had both fought for what they believed was theirs. And Hayes, she had to admit, had been remarkably fair and kind throughout this entire ordeal. He could have insisted on keeping the barn, the well, the best pasture land. Instead, he had divided things equally, perhaps even tilting slightly in her favor. He had worked alongside her without complaint. He had cared for her injury with genuine concern. He had told her the truth, even knowing she might not want to hear it. The realization that she liked him hit her with unexpected force. She liked his quiet competence, his fairness, his strength. She liked the way he treated his horses with gentle hands. She liked the small smile that appeared when he was satisfied with a job well done. And more than liking him, she found herself drawn to him in ways that felt dangerous and thrilling, and deeply disloyal to Robert's memory. Oakley forced those thoughts away and focused on finishing dinner. Hayes arrived at sunset as arranged, freshly washed and wearing a clean shirt. He had trimmed his hair and shaved, and he looked younger without the trail dust and stubble. "This looks wonderful," he said, taking in the set table and the spread of food. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It was no trouble," Oakley lied, suddenly shy. "Please sit." They sat across from each other, the tension between them now of a completely different kind. Oakley served the food and they began to eat. The chicken was perfectly roasted, the biscuits light and fluffy. Hayes ate with evident appreciation, complimenting her cooking between bites. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked. "My mother," Oakley said. "She ran a boarding house in St. Louis. I grew up in the kitchen, helping her feed dozens of boarders. When I married Robert and he wanted to come west, she made sure I knew how to cook everything from scratch." "You miss St. Louis?" "Sometimes," Oakley admitted. "I miss my mother. But I wanted the adventure, the open spaces. Robert promised me a new life out here, and I wanted to believe in that dream." "And did you find what you were looking for?" Oakley considered the question. "For a while, yes, when we first arrived and everything was new and exciting. When we were building the cabin together and planning our future. Those were good times. But then the trouble with the land claim started and everything became harder." Hayes nodded slowly. "I'm sorry I was part of what made it hard. You were just defending what was yours," Oakley said. "I understand that now. I wish circumstances had been different, but I don't blame you anymore." The admission hung in the air between them, significant and freeing. Hayes reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Thank you for saying that." Oakley looked down at their joined hands. His was large and calloused and warm. She should pull away. She should maintain proper boundaries. But she found she didn't want to. "Tell me about yourself," she said instead. "I know almost nothing about you beyond the land claim." Hayes leaned back, releasing her hand, and Oakley felt an irrational disappointment at the loss of contact. "Not much to tell. I grew up on a ranch in Texas. Learned to ride and rope and work cattle from the time I could walk. My parents died when I was 17. Yellow fever. I sold the ranch to pay their debts and hired on as a drover. Been moving cattle up and down the Kishom Trail ever since, saving money, looking for a place to settle." "And this is it. This is where you want to settle." "It is," Hayes said with certainty. "I'm tired of drifting, Oakley. I'm 28 years old and I have nothing to show for it but a horse, some gear, and half a homestead. I want to build something. I want roots. Maybe a family someday." "No sweetheart waiting for you back in Texas." The question came out before Oakley could stop it. Too bold, too revealing. Hayes met her eyes and she saw something flicker in those amber depths. "No. No one waiting, you. Just memories," Oakley said softly. "And grief. And now this strange new life I never planned for." They finished dinner in a silence that felt charged with possibility. Oakley served the cherry pie and Hayes praised it lavishly. As the evening deepened, candles replaced the fading daylight, casting warm shadows around the cabin. They talked about inconsequential things. The weather. The coming winter. The cattle market. safe topics that kept them from addressing the tension building between them. Finally, Hayes stood. "I should go. It's late and you need your rest." "Stay," Oakley said, then blushed furiously. "I mean, it's dark. You could sleep in the barn, the loft. Save yourself the ride back to your camp." Hayes studied her face, and Oakley had the sense he was seeing right through her flimsy excuse to the truth beneath. She didn't want him to leave. She didn't want to be alone tonight. "All right," he said gently. "Thank you." Oakley walked him to the barn, carrying a lantern. The loft was dusty but spacious, with old hay bales that could be arranged into a makeshift bed. She found some blankets and helped him spread them out. "This is comfortable enough," Hayes said. "I've slept in far worse places. There's fresh water in the trough if you need it in the morning. And help yourself to breakfast from the kitchen before you start work." "Oakley," Hayes said, catching her hand as she turned to go, "thank you for tonight, for everything." She looked up at him in the lamplight. He was standing so close she could see flecks of green in his amber eyes. Her heart was beating too fast, and she knew she should step back, maintain distance. Remember that Robert had been dead only 3 months. But she found herself swaying toward him instead, drawn by something she didn't want to name. Hayes raised his hand slowly and touched her cheek, a gentle brush of his fingers that made her breath catch. "I know this is complicated," he said softly. "I know you're grieving and I'm the last person you should be drawn to, but I can't stop thinking about you." "This is wrong," Oakley whispered, but she didn't pull away. "I know. Robert's only been gone since June. I know, people will talk. Let them talk." Hayes leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to step back to stop this before it began. But Oakley found herself tilting her face up to meet him, her eyes closing as his lips brushed hers in the gentlest of kisses. It was nothing like kissing Robert. Robert had been enthusiastic but clumsy, all eagerness and little skill. Hayes kissed her like she was precious, like he was afraid she might break. His lips were soft and patient, asking rather than demanding. Oakley felt something inside her crack open, some frozen place that grief had locked away when they parted. She was trembling. Hayes rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "I should apologize for that," he said, "but I'm not sorry." "Neither am I," Oakley admitted, shocking herself with her honesty. "What do we do now?" Oakley stepped back, needing distance to think clearly. "I don't know. This is all so fast, so unexpected. I need time to think." "Take all the time you need," Hayes said. "I'm not going anywhere." Oakley fled back to the house, her heart pounding, her lips still tingling from that kiss. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, trying to calm her racing thoughts. What had she just done? What was she doing? Robert had been dead only 3 months. 3 months. It was too soon. It was improper. It was wrong, but it hadn't felt wrong. It had felt like coming alive again after being frozen for so long. Oakley touched her lips, remembering the warmth of Hayes's mouth on hers. Then she went to her room and stared at the photograph of Robert on the dresser. He looked so young in the picture, barely 23, his whole future ahead of him. A future that had been cut short by stress and illness and bad luck. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the photograph. "I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if I'm dishonoring your memory or finally moving forward. I don't know anything anymore." The photograph, of course, didn't answer. Oakley undressed and climbed into bed, but sleep was a long time coming. Her mind kept returning to that kiss, to the feel of Hayes's hand on her cheek, to the possibility of something new growing from the ashes of her old life. The next morning, Oakley rose early and prepared a large breakfast. She told herself it was just being neighborly, but she knew it was more than that. She wanted to see Hayes, needed to see him to confirm that last night had been real and not just some grief-induced dream. He appeared at her door just after sunrise, hat in hand. "Morning." "Good morning," Oakley said, suddenly awkward. "I made breakfast. I can see that. Smells wonderful." They ate together at her table, both of them careful not to mention the kiss. They talked about work instead. Hayes needed to repair the barn roof before winter. Oakley wanted to bring in more firewood. There were chores enough to keep them busy for months. After breakfast, Hayes stood to leave. "I'll start on that roof today, but Oakley, about last night." "Yes, I meant what I said. Take all the time you need to figure out how you feel. But know that I'm here and I care about you, and whenever you're ready to talk about it, I'm listening." Oakley felt tears prick her eyes at his kindness. "Thank you." The days that followed fell into a new pattern. Hayes worked on making the barn loft habitable while Oakley tended to her half of the property. But they found themselves gravitating together throughout the day. Hayes would help her with heavy chores, chopping wood or moving hay bales. Oakley would bring him lunch and they would eat together, talking easily now, barriers coming down. She learned more about him each day. That he could play the harmonica and sometimes played in the evenings, the music drifting across the fence line to her cabin. That he had a wry sense of humor that emerged when he was comfortable. That he was patient with animals but had a quick temper when tools didn't work properly, though he never directed that temper at people. That he was lonely, just as lonely as she was, craving companionship and conversation after years of solitary drifting, and she found herself sharing things with him that she had never told anyone. About her childhood in St. Louis, the daughter of a boarding house keeper who had married a dreamer. About her fears when Robert first suggested moving west, and her determination to be brave for him. About the miscarriage she had suffered their second year, the baby they had wanted so desperately and lost at 4 months. About the isolation of homestead life, the weeks when Robert would be gone hunting or working odd jobs and she would go days without speaking to another human soul. Hayes listened to all of it with patient attention, never judging, never offering platitudes, just listening, understanding. October arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and shorter days. The aspen on the hillsides blazed gold against the dark pine, and the morning frost lingered longer each day. Hayes finished his work on the barn loft and moved in properly, bringing his few belongings from his camp. Now he was truly a permanent presence, just across the fence line. They had not kissed again since that night in the barn. Hayes was keeping his word, giving her space to grieve and think. But the attraction between them was growing stronger, impossible to ignore. Oakley would catch herself watching him work, admiring the strength in his shoulders, the competent way he handled every task. And she would see him watching her too, his gaze following her as she moved about her chores, expression unreadable. One evening in mid-October, a storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing the first real snow of the season. The temperature plummeted and the wind howled around the cabin. Oakley built up her fire and made a pot of stew, but as the evening wore on, she found herself worrying about Hayes in the barn. The loft had a stove, but was it enough to keep him warm in this kind of weather? Unable to shake her concern, she bundled up and carried a basket of hot stew across the property. Snow was already accumulating, and the walk to the barn was difficult. She found Hayes in the loft, huddled near his small stove, wrapped in blankets. "I brought you something hot," Oakley said, climbing up the ladder. Hayes's face lit up when he saw her. "You didn't have to brave the storm for me. I was worried you might be cold." Hayes looked around the loft ruefully. "It's not the warmest place I've ever lived, I'll admit. The wind comes right through the cracks." Oakley handed him the stew and watched him eat. The loft really wasn't suitable for winter living, she realized. Hayes had done his best with limited materials, but it was basically a barn with a stove, not a proper dwelling. He would freeze up here when the real cold arrived. You should stay in the house, she heard herself say. Hayes paused mid-bite. What? The house? There's a spare room. It's small, but it's warm and dry. You can't stay up here all winter. Oakley, I can't impose like that. It's not an imposition. It's practical. We're sharing the property anyway. We might as well share the house too. Hayes set down his bowl. Are you sure about this? People will talk. Let them talk, Oakley said, echoing his words from that night they kissed. I'm a widow sharing her house with her neighbor to keep him from freezing. There's nothing scandalous about that. There will be if they see the way I look at you, Hayes said quietly. Oakley felt heat rise in her cheeks. Then we'll be discreet. But I can't have you freezing to death up here. It wouldn't be Christian. Hayes studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. All right, thank you. I'll gather my things. They made the trip back to the house together through the swirling snow. Hayes carried his saddle, bags, and bedroll, the sum total of his possessions. Oakley showed him to the small room off the main living area, barely large enough for a bed and a chest, but warm and snug. It's perfect, Hayes said. Better than I deserve. Nonsense. You've earned it with all the work you've done around here. Hayes set down his gear and turned to face her. Oakley, I want you to know that I respect your grief and your process. Having me under your roof doesn't change anything. I'm here as a friend and neighbor, nothing more until you say otherwise. I know, Oakley said softly, and I appreciate that, but Hayes, I think I'm ready to say otherwise. His eyes widened. Are you certain? In answer, Oakley stepped forward and kissed him, more boldly this time, with more certainty. Hayes wrapped his arms around her and kissed her back, and it was like coming home to a place she hadn't known she was searching for. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Hayes cradled her face in his hands. I'm falling in love with you, he said. I know it's too soon and too complicated, but it's the truth. I'm falling in love with you too, Oakley admitted. And you're right, it's too soon. Robert's been gone barely 4 months, but I can't seem to help it. You make me feel alive again. Then we'll take it slow, Hayes said. We'll do this right. I want to court you properly, Oakley. I want everyone to know that I respect you and value you and that my intentions are honorable. In a house where we're living under the same roof, Oakley laughed. Then I'll court you under the same roof, Hayes said with a grin. The most proper, respectable courtship you've ever seen. And he did. Over the weeks that followed, Hayes courted Oakley with old-fashioned determination. He never entered her bedroom, always knocking before coming into any room where she might be. He helped with every chore without being asked, splitting wood and hauling water and mending fences. He brought her wildflowers even though it was late in the season and flowers were scarce. He played his harmonica for her in the evenings while she sewed by the fire. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Hayes told her stories of the cattle drives, of towns he had seen and people he had met. Oakley shared her dreams for the homestead, the garden she wanted to expand, the chickens she hoped to raise. They discovered shared tastes in books and music. They argued amiably about politics and religion and the best way to train a horse. And slowly, carefully, they grew closer. A touch on the shoulder as they passed in the narrow cabin, sitting a little nearer each evening by the fire. Hands brushing as they worked together. Stolen kisses when the moment felt right, sweet and tender and filled with promise. November arrived, bringing deeper cold and more snow. Hayes made a trip to Fairplay for supplies and returned with news that set the town buzzing. Judge Warren had approved their shared living arrangement as practical and necessary for winter survival, but only on the condition that they marry by spring to preserve propriety. The judge, it seemed, was less concerned with scandal than with the health and safety of his citizens. So we have until spring, Hayes said, shaking snow from his hat. The judge said April at the latest. Oakley felt her heart skip. He's giving us an ultimatum. More like a timeline, Hayes said carefully. Oakley, I want to marry you. I want it more than anything, but only if you're ready, only if you're sure. Was she sure? Oakley examined her feelings carefully. She still loved Robert, still missed him, still felt grief when she thought of all they had lost. But Robert was gone, and she was alive, and Hayes had become essential to her happiness in ways she couldn't deny. With Hayes, she felt safe and valued and cherished. He listened to her opinions, respected her knowledge, treated her as a full partner in all things, and she loved him. She loved his quiet strength, his fairness, his kindness to animals and people alike. She loved the way he looked at her like she was precious. She loved waking up knowing he was just in the next room, that she wasn't alone anymore. I'm sure, Oakley said. But let's wait until spring anyway. Let me have a full year to mourn Robert properly, and let's use the winter to make sure this is really what we both want. That's fair, Hayes agreed. Spring it is. The winter months were both challenging and wonderful. The snow piled deep, and there were days when they were completely snowed in, unable to leave the cabin. But those days became precious, a chance to simply be together without the pressure of work. They played cards and read aloud to each other and cooked elaborate meals just for the pleasure of it. Hayes taught Oakley to play the harmonica, and though she was terrible at it, he praised her efforts with such genuine enthusiasm that she kept trying. Oakley taught Hayes to bake bread, and his first loaf came out hard as a rock, but they laughed until they cried and then fed it to the chickens. They celebrated Christmas together, exchanging small gifts. Hayes gave her a beautiful shawl he had purchased on his last trip to town, soft wool in a deep blue that brought out her eyes. Oakley gave him a new leather belt she had tooled herself with an intricate pattern of vines and flowers. They hung evergreen boughs around the cabin and sang carols by the fire, and it was the happiest Christmas Oakley could remember. January brought blizzards that lasted for days. They huddled close to the fire, burning through their woodpile faster than anticipated. Hayes would bundle up and brave the storm to bring in more wood, returning half frozen, and Oakley would warm him with hot coffee and blankets and her own body heat, both of them wrapped together on the settee until he stopped shivering. Those moments of physical closeness were both sweet and torturous. Hayes never pushed for more than she was willing to give, but Oakley could feel the desire building between them, the awareness of each other as man and woman, not just companions. More than once she was tempted to invite him to her bed, propriety be damned, but she held back. Hayes deserved better than a hurried coupling driven by winter isolation and loneliness. When they came together, it should be as husband and wife, with nothing to regret or hide. February brought a brief thaw, and they used the opportunity to check on the cattle and repair some storm damage to the barn. Working side by side in the cold sunshine, Oakley marveled at how natural it felt to be partners with Hayes. They moved in sync, anticipating each other's needs, working efficiently as a team. This was what marriage should be, she thought. Not just romance and passion, but partnership and respect and shared labor toward common goals. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Hayes pulled out a small wooden box. "I have something for you," he said, suddenly nervous. "I made it. I'm not much of a craftsman, but I wanted you to have something from my hands, not just bought from a store." Oakley opened the box to find a delicate wooden hair comb, carved from pine and polished smooth. The handle was decorated with tiny carved flowers, each petal distinct and perfect. "Hayes, it's beautiful," she breathed. "You made this." "Spent the last 2 months working on it," he admitted. "I'd carve a bit each night after you went to bed. I wanted to give you something special." Oakley traced the carved flowers with her finger, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Help me put it in my hair." Hayes moved behind her and carefully removed her evening braid, running his fingers through her hair to loosen it. The intimacy of the gesture made Oakley shiver. He arranged her hair and positioned the comb, his touch gentle and reverent. "There," he said softly. "Perfect." Oakley turned to face him and saw such love in his eyes that it took her breath away. "I love you," she said. "I need you to know that, completely and without reservation. I love you." "I love you too," Hayes replied, "more than I knew it was possible to love someone." They kissed, deep and slow, and for the first time Oakley allowed herself to imagine their wedding night, the moment when they would finally be fully together. The thought made her tremble with anticipation. "Soon," she whispered against his lips. "Soon we'll be married and this waiting will be over." "Worth waiting for," Hayes assured her. "You're worth waiting for." March arrived with mud and melt and the first signs of spring. The snow retreated, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green. The cattle grew restless, eager for fresh grazing, and Oakley's mourning period reached its end. Robert had died in June, and now it was March of the following year. 9 months. Not quite a full year, but close enough to satisfy convention. "I want to set a date," Oakley told Hayes one morning over breakfast. "I'm ready." Hayes's face lit up. "When?" "April 15th. That gives us time to make arrangements, but not so much time that I lose my nerve." "You're nervous, terrified," Oakley admitted. "What if people in town judge me for remarrying so soon? What if they think poorly of us?" Hayes reached across the table and took her hand. "Let them think what they want. We know the truth. We know this is real and good and right. That's all that matters." They rode into Fairplay the next week to speak with Judge Warren and make the arrangements. The judge was pleased to see them, greeting them warmly in his office. "I hoped you two would work things out," he said. "You're both good people caught in bad circumstances. You deserve happiness." They set the date officially and arranged for a simple ceremony at the courthouse. Oakley felt a pang of sadness that it wouldn't be a church wedding with all the trimmings, but that felt too soon, too celebratory. A quiet courthouse ceremony felt more appropriate for a widow's remarriage. The news spread through Fairplay quickly, and the reaction was mixed. Some people congratulated them warmly, pleased to see a young widow finding happiness again. Others were more judgmental, whispering that 9 months was hardly enough mourning time, that there was something unseemly about a woman living under the same roof as a man she wasn't married to, that perhaps there had been something going on even before Robert's death. The gossip hurt, but Oakley held her head high. She knew the truth. She knew she had loved Robert faithfully until his death. She knew that nothing improper had happened between her and Hayes until months after she was widowed. And she knew that what she and Hayes had was real and lasting and worth fighting for. Hayes bought a simple gold ring from the general store, spending the last of his savings on it. Oakley used cloth from the mercantile to make a new dress, not white, which would be inappropriate for a widow, but a soft dove gray that brought out the blue in her eyes. She altered one of Robert's old shirts to fit Hayes, creating a proper dress shirt for the ceremony. The night before the wedding, Hayes moved back to the barn loft, insisting on propriety for this final night. "Tomorrow night you'll be my wife," he said, kissing her gently goodbye. "I can wait one more night." Oakley lay alone in her bed, too excited to sleep. Tomorrow she would be Oakley Xavier. Tomorrow she would begin a new chapter of her life. She thought of Robert, as she often did, sending him a silent prayer of thanks for the years they had shared and asking his forgiveness for moving forward without him. She liked to think he would understand, that he would want her to be happy rather than lonely and alone. The morning of April 15th dawned bright and clear, a perfect spring day. Oakley dressed carefully in her new gray dress and pinned her hair up with the comb Hayes had carved for her. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. She looked happy. The grief that had carved lines in her face was still there, but softened now, tempered by hope and love. Hayes arrived to escort her to town, and Oakley's breath caught at the sight of him. He wore the shirt she had made, paired with his best trousers and a string tie. He had trimmed his hair and shaved, and he looked handsome and nervous and dear. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "So do you," Oakley replied, making him laugh. They rode to Fairplay together, side by side, and Oakley felt her nervousness fade. This was right. This was exactly as it should be. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The courthouse was surprisingly crowded when they arrived. Judge Warren was there, of course, and the clerk who would file their marriage certificate. But there were also a dozen townspeople, some who had come to support them, others likely drawn by curiosity and the prospect of gossip. Oakley recognized Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile, and Mr. Patterson who ran the assay office, and several other faces from her previous trips to town. Judge Warren smiled at them from behind his desk. "Are we ready to begin?" "We are," Hayes said firmly, taking Oakley's hand. The ceremony was brief and simple. Judge Warren spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about commitment and partnership and building a life together. He asked Hayes if he would take Oakley as his lawfully wedded wife, to love and honor all the days of his life. Hayes answered, "I will," his voice strong and sure. Then the judge turned to Oakley. "Oakley Zimmerman, do you take Hayes Xavier to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and honor all the days of your life?" Oakley looked up at Hayes, at this good man who had become her partner and friend and love. "I will," she said clearly. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife. Hayes, you may kiss your bride." Hayes cupped Oakley's face in his hands and kissed her gently, sweetly, as applause broke out around them. When they parted, Oakley saw tears in his eyes that matched her own. They were married. She was Oakley Xavier now, beginning a new life with a new name and a new chance at happiness. The crowd surged forward to congratulate them. Mrs. Henderson hugged Oakley warmly and pressed a package into her hands. "A little wedding gift," she said. "Some nice things for your home." Mr. Patterson shook Hayes's hand vigorously. "Congratulations, Xavier. You got yourself a fine woman there." Even some of the more skeptical townspeople offered grudging good wishes. Oakley felt the weight of judgment lifting slightly. Perhaps in time, people would see that this marriage was real and lasting, not some hasty mistake. Judge Warren pulled them aside before they left. "I'm glad I could help bring something good out of all this mess with the land claim," he said. "You two make a fine couple. I wish you every happiness." "Thank you, Judge," Hayes said, "for everything, for the fair ruling and for believing in us." They rode back to the homestead as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Everything looked different to Oakley now, washed in the golden light of new beginnings. This wasn't just her homestead anymore, or Hayes's land, or even their shared property. This was their home. The place where they would build their life together. Hayes helped her down from her horse and swept her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold of the cabin. "Mrs. Xavier," he said with a grin, "welcome home." Oakley laughed, giddy with happiness and nerves and anticipation. Hayes set her down gently and cupped her face, his expression suddenly serious. "Are you happy?" he asked. "So happy," Oakley assured him. "Are you?" "Happier than I ever thought possible," Hayes replied. He kissed her softly, then deeper, and Oakley felt heat blooming through her body. This was her husband, her partner, her love, and tonight finally they could express that love fully. Hayes pulled back slightly, searching her face. "Are you nervous?" "A little," Oakley admitted. "But mostly I'm just eager to finally be with you properly." "We'll take it slow," Hayes promised. "I want this to be good for you." He led her to the bedroom, and Oakley felt her heart pounding as he began to carefully remove the pins from her hair, letting it fall in waves over her shoulders. His fingers were gentle, patient, taking his time. When her hair was loose, he pressed kisses to her temples, her cheeks, her jaw, making her shiver with pleasure. "You're so beautiful," he murmured against her skin. Oakley reached up to unbutton his shirt, her fingers trembling slightly. Hayes stood still, letting her work, his breathing growing heavier as she revealed his chest. She ran her hands over his skin, feeling the strength in him, the warmth. They undressed each other slowly, between kisses and whispered words of love. And when they finally came together, it was everything Oakley had hoped for and more. Hayes was gentle and attentive, making sure she was comfortable, that she was with him every step of the way. The pleasure built slowly between them, a shared journey of discovery and intimacy. Afterward they lay tangled together, skin to skin, hearts racing in sync. Oakley felt tears sliding down her temples, not from sadness but from the overwhelming rightness of it all. "Are you all right?" Hayes asked, concern in his voice. "I'm perfect," Oakley assured him. "That was perfect." "You're perfect." Hayes gathered her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I love you, Oakley Xavier." "I love you too," she whispered, and fell asleep in her husband's arms, more content than she had been in over a year. The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment and joy. Hayes moved all his belongings into Oakley's bedroom, and they transformed it into their shared space. They fell into new rhythms and routines, learning each other's habits and preferences. Hayes liked his coffee strong and black. Oakley preferred tea in the mornings. Hayes was an early riser who bounded out of bed full of energy. Oakley liked to wake slowly, stretching and easing into the day. They worked the homestead together, now truly a unified operation. The fence that had once divided them became just another fence, a property marker with no emotional weight. They ran the cattle as a single herd, tended the garden together, made repairs and improvements side by side. In May, they received word that the land office in Denver had finalized all the paperwork. The homestead was officially registered in both their names, joint owners with equal rights. The bureaucratic nightmare that had started this whole mess was finally, officially resolved. "It's really ours now," Oakley said, looking at the official documents. "All of it. No disputes, no divided claims, just ours. Our land, our home, our life," Hayes agreed, pulling her into his arms. "Everything I ever wanted." June brought the anniversary of Robert's death. Oakley woke that morning feeling melancholy, memories of the past year washing over her. Hayes held her close, understanding without words that she needed space to grieve. "I'm going to visit his grave," Oakley said. "Would you come with me?" Hayes looked surprised but pleased. "Of course." They rode into town together and made their way to the small cemetery on the hill above Fairplay. Robert's grave was marked with a simple wooden cross that Hayes himself had carved over the winter, at Oakley's request. She laid wildflowers on the grave and stood in silence for a long moment. "I want you to know I'm happy," she said softly, speaking to Robert. "I loved you and I miss you, but I'm happy now. Hayes is a good man. He takes care of me and I take care of him, and we're building something real together. I hope you understand. I hope you approve." Hayes stood a respectful distance away, giving her privacy for her goodbye. When Oakley finally turned away from the grave, her eyes were red but her expression was peaceful. "Thank you for coming with me," she said, taking Hayes's hand. "Thank you for including me," Hayes replied. "Robert was part of your life, part of what made you who you are. I would never ask you to forget him." They rode home in companionable silence, and Oakley felt a sense of closure settling over her. She would always carry Robert in her heart, but she could move forward now without guilt, secure in the knowledge that she had honored his memory properly. July brought intense heat and the hard work of haying. They worked from dawn until dusk, cutting and drying the grass, stacking it in the barn for winter feed. It was back-breaking labor, but satisfying. Hayes worked shirtless in the heat, and Oakley found herself distracted by the sight of him, muscles moving under sun-bronzed skin. More than once he caught her watching and grinned, making her blush. One particularly hot afternoon, they took a break at the creek, wading into the cold water to cool off. Hayes splashed her playfully, and Oakley retaliated, and soon they were engaged in a full water fight, laughing like children. They ended up in each other's arms, kissing in the middle of the creek, the cold water swirling around their legs. "I never knew I could be this happy," Oakley said, looking up at her husband's smiling face. "Neither did I," Hayes admitted. "You're everything to me, Oakley." August brought news that made them both whoop with joy. Oakley's monthly courses didn't come, and when they continued not to come, she began to suspect what it might mean. A visit to the doctor in Fairplay confirmed it. She was pregnant, about 8 weeks along. The baby would come in early spring. Hayes was beside himself with excitement. He immediately began making plans, talking about enlarging the cabin to add a nursery, about buying a cradle and baby clothes, about teaching their child to ride and rope and work the land. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Oakley found herself caught up in the joy of it all. This pregnancy felt different from the one she had lost with Robert. She felt stronger, healthier, more confident. And she had Hayes beside her every step of the way, attentive to her needs, protective but not smothering. September brought cooler temperatures and the turning of the aspen. A year ago, Oakley had stood in the courthouse and learned her life was about to be turned upside down. Now she stood on the porch of her home, Hayes's arm around her shoulders, and marveled at how much had changed. A year ago she had been alone, grieving, facing an uncertain future. Now she had a husband, a baby on the way, and a home that was truly hers. "What are you thinking about?" Hayes asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "About how much can change in a year," Oakley said. "About how grateful I am for all of it, even the hard parts." "The hard parts brought us together," Hayes pointed out. "That's true. If Judge Warren had ruled differently, if he had given the whole homestead to you or to me, we might never have gotten to know each other." "I don't want to think about that," Hayes said with a shudder. "I can't imagine my life without you now." "You don't have to," Oakley assured him. "I'm not going anywhere." They spent the fall preparing for winter and for the baby. Hayes built a beautiful cradle from pine, carved with the same delicate flowers he had put on Oakley's hair comb. Oakley sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands creating a layette for their child. They argued amiably about names, Hayes favoring strong traditional names while Oakley preferred something more unusual. October brought the first snow, and with it a sense of full circle. A year ago they had been building that fence together, enemies forced into cooperation. Now they were husband and wife, preparing to welcome their first child. Oakley thought about that fence often, about how something meant to divide them had ended up bringing them together. Winter came on strong, but this year Oakley didn't fear it. She had Hayes beside her, keeping the fire burning and the wood stocked. She had food in the larder and a warm house and a baby growing inside her. She had everything she needed. As the months passed and her belly grew round with child, Hayes became even more attentive. He wouldn't let her lift anything heavy or work too hard. He rubbed her swollen feet in the evenings and brought her tea in bed in the mornings. He talked to the baby, pressing his ear to her belly to listen for movement, his face lighting up every time he felt a kick. "Strong one," he would say with pride. "Takes after you." Or you, Oakley would counter. "You're not exactly delicate." Christmas was a joyous celebration, their second as a couple but their first as a married pair expecting a child. Hayes carved a small wooden horse for the baby, working on it secretly for weeks. Oakley knitted a tiny sweater in soft yellow wool. They hung evergreen boughs and sang carols and made love gently by the firelight, careful of her expanding belly. January and February were the waiting months. Oakley grew increasingly uncomfortable, her belly huge, the baby active and constantly moving. She waddled more than walked, and getting up from a chair required Hayes's assistance. But she had never felt more beautiful, because Hayes looked at her like she was a miracle. "You're growing our child," he would say, pressing kisses to her belly. "You're the most amazing thing I've ever seen." In early March, on a cold night with stars bright overhead, Oakley felt the first pains. She woke Hayes calmly, though her heart was racing. "It's time." Hayes leaped out of bed in a panic, running around gathering supplies before Oakley grabbed his hand and made him stop. "Breathe," she said. "We have time. First babies take a while." Hayes rode for the midwife in town while Oakley prepared. By the time he returned with Mrs. Henderson, who served as midwife for the area, the pains were stronger and closer together. Mrs. Henderson examined her and pronounced everything progressing normally. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the next day. Hayes stayed with her the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement. When Oakley was sure she couldn't take any more, when she was exhausted and hurting and ready to give up, Hayes looked into her eyes and said, "You're the strongest person I know. You can do this. Just a little more." And she did. With one final push, their baby entered the world with a lusty cry. Mrs. Henderson cleaned the infant and wrapped it in a blanket, then placed the bundle in Oakley's arms. "You have a son," she announced with a smile. Oakley looked down at the tiny red face of her baby boy, at the shock of dark hair and the small fists waving in the air. She felt love crash over her like a wave, so intense it took her breath away. This was her son, hers and Hayes's, a new life born from their love. Hayes leaned over to look at their child, tears streaming down his face. "He's perfect," he whispered. "You're perfect. Thank you, Oakley. Thank you for this gift." They named him Henry William Xavier. Henry for no one in particular, but because they both liked the strong sound of it, and William after Hayes's father. Little Henry had his father's amber eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. And from the moment he was born, he had his parents wrapped around his tiny finger. The weeks that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Henry was a healthy baby with good lungs, and he made his needs known loudly and often. Oakley and Hayes took turns walking him when he was fussy, both of them bleary-eyed from lack of sleep, but happier than they had ever been. Hayes was a devoted father, changing diapers without complaint and singing to Henry in a surprisingly good voice. He would hold his son for hours, just watching him sleep, wonder written across his face. "I can't believe he's ours," he would say. "I can't believe we made this perfect little person." As spring turned to summer, Henry grew and thrived. He smiled at 6 weeks, laughed at 2 months, and by 4 months was a chubby, happy baby who clearly knew his parents and lit up when they entered his sight. Oakley felt herself settling into motherhood with more ease than she had expected. Yes, it was exhausting and demanding, but it was also deeply fulfilling. She loved nursing her son, feeling him warm and solid in her arms. She loved watching Hayes with Henry, seeing this strong cowboy reduced to puddles of mush by a baby's smile. They took Henry to town for the first time in late July, and the townspeople cooed over him appropriately. Judge Warren held the baby and pronounced him a fine specimen. Mrs. Henderson beamed with pride, as midwives do over the babies they delivered. Even the most judgmental gossips had to admit that Oakley and Hayes seemed genuinely happy together, and that their son was clearly well loved and cared for. By the time Henry was 6 months old, Oakley found herself thinking about another baby. She wanted Henry to have siblings, wanted their house filled with the noise and chaos of children. When she mentioned it to Hayes, his face lit up. "I'd love that," he said. "A house full of children growing up on this land we built together. It sounds perfect." August brought their second wedding anniversary, and they celebrated quietly at home, Henry asleep in his cradle between them. Hayes gave Oakley a locket with a tiny photograph of Henry inside. Oakley gave Hayes a new saddle she had saved for months to purchase. They sat on the porch as the sun set, watching the play of light on the mountains, and reflected on how far they had come. "2 years ago we were enemies," Oakley said. "Building that fence, barely able to be civil to each other." "Best fence I ever built," Hayes said with a grin. "It brought me you. And now we have Henry and this home and this life we've built together. And hopefully more children on the way," Hayes added, pulling her close. "I want at least 4. 4, Oakley laughed. "You're ambitious." "Maybe 5, Hayes amended, "or 6. I want the house bursting with life and love." They did have more children. 14 months after Henry was born, Oakley delivered a daughter they named Helena Rose. 2 years after that came twin boys, Howard and Hugh. And 3 years after the twins, a final daughter, Harriet Jean. Their house expanded to accommodate the growing family. Hayes added rooms and a second story, until the original cabin was just the heart of a larger home. The homestead prospered under their joint management. They acquired more cattle, more land when neighboring properties became available, built new barns and outbuildings. But through all the growth and change, the original fence remained, now more symbol than actual boundary. Hayes and Oakley would sometimes walk the fence line together in the evenings after the children were in bed, remembering those early days when they had built it together. 2 enemies forced into cooperation who had found love in the most unexpected place. Years passed in the good rhythm of family life. Henry grew tall and serious, taking after his father in temperament and his mother in stubbornness. Helena was sweet and artistic, always drawing or making things. The twins were wild and adventurous, constantly getting into mischief. And Harriet was the baby, adored by everyone, a ray of sunshine in human form. Oakley and Hayes grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They had disagreements and hard times, as all couples do. There were drought years when the cattle suffered, an illness that swept through the children, and the constant challenges of frontier life. But through it all, they faced every challenge together, partners in every sense of the word. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration at the homestead. Henry and his wife had taken over most of the daily ranching operations. Helena had married a lawyer in Denver, but visited often with her own children. The twins were working their own claims nearby, and Harriet was courting the son of the assay office owner. Oakley looked around at the gathering, at her children and grandchildren filling the house and spilling out onto the porch and lawn, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. She found Hayes standing by the fence, the original fence they had built together all those years ago, now weathered and gray but still standing strong. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. "About that day in the courthouse," Hayes said. When Judge Warren announced his ruling and you looked like you wanted to murder me, Oakley laughed. I absolutely did want to murder you. I thought you were the worst thing that had ever happened to me. And now I think you're the best thing that ever happened to me, Oakley said, standing on her toes to kiss his cheek. That fence brought us together. That impossible situation that felt like the end of everything was actually the beginning of everything. Hayes wrapped his arms around her, and they stood together by the fence as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, just as it had done on so many evenings over the past 25 years. Their children and grandchildren laughed and played around them, the sound of family filling the air. I love you, Oakley Xavier, Hayes said, as he had said countless times over the years. I love you too, Oakley replied, as she always did. Today, tomorrow, and all the days to come. They stood together as the stars began to emerge overhead. Two people who had started as enemies, become partners, and ended as soulmates. The fence that had once divided them stood as a testament to their love, a reminder that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the worst trials. And as they walked back to the house hand in hand, surrounded by the family and the life they had built together, Oakley sent up a silent prayer of thanks for stubborn judges, disputed land claims, and fences built with reluctant hands that had become the foundation of a love that would last a lifetime. The homestead continued to thrive long after that anniversary celebration. Henry proved to be an excellent rancher, expanding the operations while maintaining his parents' commitment to quality and fairness. Helena's legal connections helped protect the family's interests during various land disputes and business dealings. The twins, despite their wild youth, settled into responsible adulthood and became pillars of the growing community. And Harriet married her sweetheart and moved into a house just down the road, close enough to visit daily with her own growing brood of children. Oakley and Hayes gradually stepped back from the daily operations of the ranch, content to advise when asked and dote on their grandchildren. They spent their days doing smaller tasks, tending the garden, mending tack, and mostly just enjoying each other's company after decades of hard work. On a warm September afternoon, nearly 30 years after that fateful day in the courthouse, Oakley and Hayes sat on their porch watching their youngest grandchildren play in the yard. The original fence was gone now, replaced multiple times over the years, but a section of it had been preserved and now hung in the barn, a family heirloom. You ever regret it? Oakley asked suddenly. Not the marriage, but the way it all happened, the fight over the land, the stress, all of it. Hayes considered the question carefully, as he always did. I regret that Robert died, he said honestly. I regret that you had to go through that pain, but regret us? Never, not for a single moment, even when I was horrible to you during the fence building. Even then, Hayes confirmed with a smile, you were magnificent in your anger, fierce and strong and beautiful. I was half in love with you even when you hated me. I never really hated you, Oakley admitted. I wanted to, but even then I could see you were a good man. That scared me more than anything. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold. The land they had fought over, divided and ultimately shared, had become the foundation of a legacy that would last for generations. The homestead that had started as a point of bitter contention had transformed into a family home filled with love and laughter. You know what I think? Oakley said eventually. I think Judge Warren knew exactly what he was doing when he split that homestead between us. Hayes raised an eyebrow. You think he was matchmaking? I think he was wise enough to see that two stubborn people forced to work together might just discover they were better together than apart. A romantic at heart, our Judge Warren, Hayes said with a chuckle. Or just very practical, Oakley countered. Two people, one homestead, both with legitimate claims. Why not make them figure it out together? Whatever the judge's intentions had been, the result was undeniable. From division had come unity. From enmity had come love. From two separate, struggling homesteaders had come a family dynasty that would shape the region for generations. As evening fell and their grandchildren were called in for supper by their parents, Hayes helped Oakley to her feet. She moved a little slower now, her joints stiff with age, but her spirit was as strong as ever. Together they walked into the house, Hayes's arm steady around her waist, both of them grateful for every moment they had been given. The legacy of that divided homestead, of that fence built with reluctant hands, lived on not just in the land and the buildings, but in the love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings. And on quiet evenings when the grandchildren begged for stories, Oakley and Hayes would tell them about the judge who split one homestead between two enemies, and how the cowboy and the widow built one fence together and discovered a love that would last forever. Their story became part of family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. Future generations would hear about the great-grandparents who started as enemies and ended as the most devoted couple anyone had ever seen. The fence, that symbol of division, became instead a symbol of how barriers between people can be overcome with work, patience, and an open heart. Oakley and Hayes lived to see their golden anniversary, celebrated with nearly 100 family members and friends. They lived to see the homestead expand into one of the most successful ranches in the county. They lived to see grandchildren married and great-grandchildren born. They lived to see the wild frontier they had known transform into a settled, civilized place, while still retaining the beauty and grandeur that had drawn them there in the first place. And when they finally passed within months of each other, as longtime couples often do, they were buried side by side in the Fairplay Cemetery, not far from Robert Zimmerman's grave. Their shared headstone bore a simple inscription: "Together in life, together in eternity." Built on love, division overcome. And carved beneath the words was an image of a fence, not dividing but unifying, a testament to the unexpected blessings that can come from the hardest of circumstances. The homestead remained in the family for generations, each new owner adding their own chapter to the story, while honoring the foundation laid by Oakley and Hayes. And every new generation learned the story of how their legacy began. With a judge's ruling, a divided homestead, two enemies forced to work together, and a fence that became the unlikely foundation of an enduring love story that proved even the deepest divisions can be bridged when two people are willing to meet in the middle.